Hi, I'm Scott, and I would like to welcome you to the 2024 January-February LD Topic Lecture over the topic of whether the United States should reduce its military presence in the West Asia, North Africa region. This topic lecture is going to be helpful to anybody who does Lincoln Douglas debate, regardless if it's progressive or traditional, because there's going to be lots of background information that's going to apply to anybody who does Lincoln Douglas debate on the January-February 2024 topic. So the exact wording of the 2024 January-February topic for Lincoln Douglas debate is resolved. The United States ought to substantially reduce its military presence in the West Asia, North Africa region. So before I get into all the nitty-gritty and break down the definitions and all that sorts of stuff on this topic, I would like to first take you through a brief little roadmap of what I'm going to do in this video. So I'm going to go through the definitions, have some thoughts about the topic to start, give you all some background and history in regards to both the region and the U.S.'s military presence and the military in general, as well as describe kind of what the current situation, current military presence in the region looks like. As a reminder, you'll notice that this video doesn't include any contentions, it doesn't include any counter plans, any disads, any value criterion, anything like that. And the reason for that is that this topic is so big that this topic lecture is actually going to take 3 different videos in order to get the entire scope of the topic. And even at that point, it's still not going to be comprehensive. So we're actually going to do 3 different topic lectures on this topic. The first one, the one that you're watching now, is basically good for everybody because it's going to give a bunch of topic background, a bunch of topic knowledge. It's going to break down the topic, but it's not really going to go through a specific format, a specific style, a specific meta of debate. It's more just going to be about the topic because, again, this is going to sound repetitive. This is a huge topic and it just required a lot more than any other topic that I've ever done. So that is what you have in store for you in this video. So without any further ado, I'm going to jump right into the definitions. So a reminder again, the topic reads, resolved, the United States ought to substantially reduce its military presence in the West Asia, North Africa region. So let's look at the key terms behind this resolution. So I think that there are a lot of key terms in this resolution, but a lot of them are not that important, and a lot of them are important, but it's hard to quantify what they are, which makes this topic huge. But let me kind of break them down individually before I get into all of that. So I think the keywords in this are the United States ought substantially reduce its military presence in the West Asia, North Africa region. Like, Scott, that's the whole topic. Well, let's get into it then. First, the United States, it's a federal government, obviously. The thing that's different about this topic versus other topics that we've had where people have said the state's counterplan or municipalities or local things, the federal government is pretty much in charge of the military. So there's going to be lots of people who have made those arguments in the past that aren't going to be able to rely on them just because the definition of United States when combined with the military is going to be different than those topics. Ought, just like the other topics we've had, is going to describe a moral obligation. A lot of people, because this is probably, a lot of people view this as a policy topic, are going to view this as should and just say the government ought to instrumentally do the action of the resolution. The next part of the topic is substantially. If you are familiar with policy debate, it's not often that we have substantially in LD resolutions, but in policy debate, substantially is in almost every single one. And as somebody whose background is in policy debate, the number one takeaway that I have from this is that while you could quantify substantially as, a 20% reduction in something, 25%, 50, a certain number, you can't say a number, pretty much it means nothing. So if you just do something with the topic, a lot of people will think, oh, that's substantial, and that's it, just because it's really hard to quantify what is and isn't substantial. So throughout the course of history, when debate has looked at the word substantial, it's pretty much just meant anything about the topic, which leads us to the first part of why the topic is going to be big, because substantially is not a limiting word on the topic. Reduce just means that in the direction of decreasing. There's going to be some debate as to whether or not it's permanent. I think it probably has to be permanent, that it can't be transferred somewhere, or that probably the more common definition that will be argued about would be, does it mean to eliminate, or does it just mean to reduce, and is reduce different than eliminate? So different arguments that talk about complete withdrawal might not be a substantial reduction, because that's not elimination. Now, I'm not sure that that's a great argument, but it's certainly something to think about when you're thinking about substantially reducing the military from this region. One thing that is important is the word its. Its is possessive, so a lot of the bases and troops that we're going to talk about, a lot of the bases the U.S. will have troops at, but it's not the U.S.'s base, because it's like in a foreign country at a foreign base. So you have to think that that is at least some limiting term on the topic, because it has to be something that the United States controls in terms of its presence. So let's jump into the two words that pretty much break down the topic, and that is military presence. So military presence has been debated a lot in debate before. The PF resolution in this past September and October used military presence in the Arctic, but in the past, policy resolutions, both in high school and in college, have used this. And in my experience with this, it is really hard to quantify what exactly military presence is, because there is no real good exclusive definition that says these things are not military presence. There might be a couple things that are definitely not military presence, but the key takeaway from this is that military presence throughout the history of debate has been viewed as a very inclusive term, which means I would imagine that lots of people will view this topic as just like anything about the military, which makes this topic really, really, really huge. But even if the topic would just be like bases and troops, the United States has so many different bases and troops and different outfits and equipment and weapons and all sorts of things in this region that this topic is just really huge anyway. So I'm not sure what that does to limit the topic. But just know that military presence, as you'll find out in a second, could mean a lot of different things. The other thing that's important is that our military presence in this region is hard to quantify a lot of times because it's secret. So in countries like Jordan and Israel, the United States does not publicize its military presence because it doesn't want people to know that the military is there. And also the host country doesn't want its own citizens to know that the U.S. is there, because the U.S. military is not that popular in a lot of these countries. So you're like, Scott, inclusive, exclusive, what does this mean? Well, basically, it could mean anything in the military ever, and I really didn't know how to put this next slide together, so you just kind of have to bear with me. I think that military presence could literally mean anything on this list, and you can pause this now. I'm not going to go through and read all of these things to you, but just to prove my point, since I made this, I've found at least a couple more, 5 more things that aren't in here that I think could be debatable. So things like geosynchronous satellites that stay above a region, dialogue, enhanced positioning, is the FBI military presence, right? The U.S. has a history in North Africa in Benghazi. So that's something that we'll talk about in a little bit, but that is definitely, is that the military? Is it not? And I think that a lot of these things are going to make this topic either really big or try to make it not as big. But I think a lot of people will use all sorts of different parts of this to make different arguments about military presence on this topic. So, I know you might look up here and be like, what? The Navy's not military presence? But, there's all sorts of different things that people have debated and used in the past, and all of these arguments have definitely been read on past resolutions where military presence has been one of the words in the topic. That pretty much breaks down military presence. Now let's go to the part that also makes this topic big, which is in the West Asia, North Africa region. So just like military presence, there are not a lot of definitions that are exclusive. There's not a lot of definitions that say this country is not in West Asia, North Africa. Now, like, you know, I think obviously like Argentina or like Cuba is probably not in West Asia, North Africa, but there's tons of definitions that say tons of different countries could be in this region. And I think the key takeaway is just it's going to be hard to limit out a lot of countries from this region or from this wording, which you'll find out in a second. I think the other thing is that it's also just a really big area. I think two things that are important to note about not the countries, but just the wording. First is that it's obvious with the resolution that the framers, the people who wrote the topic, did not want to use the term Middle East. So that could be something that's interesting, but also is probably like really problematic because there are really no military definitions that talk about West Asia, North Africa, because the military doesn't use that terminology. Honestly, the number one field that I could find that uses West Asia, North Africa is agriculture. So, you know, I think that that's also a reason why it's going to be really hard to say this isn't and this is West Asia, North Africa, and people are going to lean towards that region being more inclusive of lots of countries rather than excluding some countries. So without further ado, let's look at what West Asia and North Africa looks like. So you can pause this right now if you want, but I think that the countries in red, definitely West Asia, North Africa, in my opinion. I think the countries in blue, I think it would be hard to make a case to exclude them. So I think if you took both of these color combinations, you're kind of looking at every country within West Asia, North Africa. Now, you might look at the map and say, Scott, you excluded Kazakhstan, and that's a part, and I have a card that says that that's a part of West Asia. I do too, you know, but I think that that's, one, this topic is huge. Two, it just kind of proves that it's not an exclusive topic in terms of what West Asia, North Africa means. So I'm going to take my camera away for a second as I go to the next slide, because I want everybody to see as I click. This is probably what all of the countries in this region are. I know it's hard to see some of these. I know that Bahrain is so small, it's just like a circle and it doesn't actually look geographically correct, but we're going to go through all of these different regions, all of these different countries. But the one thing that I do want to talk about is there is some limiting factor to this, and that is that there's obviously going to be some countries that the United States does not have any military presence in. So, like, you know, in countries like Iran, potentially, or Morocco, or things like that, the United States doesn't have any military presence. So even though it's that region, I think that these countries are definitely, you know, maybe not a part of the topic because they don't have U.S. military presence in the actual wording of the topic. So that's pretty much what I think the topic is. And I know y'all are sitting here like, wait, you just took us through all this and give us your opinions. Where are the definitions? But here's what I've got to say to you. First is that you should stay tuned and watch the video tomorrow, because tomorrow's video is going to include a topicality file that I am going to give away for free that has all of the definitions that I've talked about here in it, and it's going to have cards from a bunch of different back files, topics, camps, things like that, but also a bunch of cards that I cut that just go through what military presence is, what West Asia, North Africa is, the countries that could be in it, all sorts of different things like that. So I'll also link these and the lecture notes that I'm using and this PowerPoint and all sorts of stuff like that below. But just know I'm not just like making up definitions. There's lots of research that's gone into this. I'm just not showing you that as I go through on the slides. So this pretty much goes through the definitions that I have breaking down the topic. Now I want to give you some initial thoughts that I have on the topic. So my initial takeaway from these definitions from the topic, first glance, doing some research, I think I've alluded to this throughout this first bit here, is that this just could potentially be maybe the biggest topic in the history of debate. If you think that substantially doesn't really quantifiably mean something, which I think historically you'd be correct in saying that, and that both West Asia, North Africa, and military presence are inclusive and not exclusive, that we could be talking about like every base troop, type of weapon system, anything like that in the region. And to just take a step back for a second, inclusive versus exclusive would mean includes or excludes. So if you think, if you have an inclusive definition of what a sport is, chess might be included in that because it's a competitive game, or debate might be included. But if you have an exclusive definition, those things would probably not be sports because they're not sports. But all of these things are up for debate. And I think a great example of sort of my thoughts is that the Army, one branch of the military alone, has 5,000 different types of helicopters. So if you got rid of one type of helicopter in one base in one region, or just talked about it, I don't even think you have to read like a planned affirmative. I think you just have a contention that says that specific helicopter in that place is bad. I think that that's really hard to answer, which makes this topic really big. So given this example, I want to next go through and give a brief background into just the U.S. military, how it works a little bit, so that going forward in this lecture, you have a better understanding of what exactly the U.S. military is if you are not coming from a background where you have a lot of prior knowledge in the U.S. Armed Forces. So the topic says its military, referring to the United States' military. So we're going to take a step back for a second for people who this might be their first encounter with the military to just kind of describe what the United States Armed Forces looked like. So the military is the armed forces of the United States, and the United States divides the military into 6 different service branches: the Army, the Navy, both of which have debate teams, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, now the Space Force, after Trump created the Space Force, and the Coast Guard. An interesting thing to note is that the first 5 are all controlled by the Department of Defense, where the 6th is controlled by the Department of Homeland Security. So the reason that the United States divides these branches into 6 different branches are that each of these branches sort of like are in charge or control different domains. So the Army is in charge of land, the Navy is in charge of the sea, the Air Force is in charge of the air, the Marines are very special in how they integrate between all 3 of these different atmospheres, the Space Force being in charge of space, and the Coast Guard protecting domestic coasts. And I know that you might be like, why are you mentioning the Coast Guard? It's about foreign places in West Asia, North Africa, but even the Coast Guard has bases in West Asia, North Africa. There's a Coast Guard base in Saudi Arabia and in Bahrain. So these different branches actually do matter in terms of the military. And some things to note is that these different branches all have different weapons. There's different air bases, different Navy ports. And the United States just has countless planes, ships, weapons, armaments, equipment, all sorts of things like that. So when I was looking at this topic, one of the things that I found interesting is that the Air Force is the world's largest air force, but the Navy is the 4th largest, and the Marines are the 7th largest. So it's kind of interesting in how all of these things intertwine with one another. One of the things that is interesting to note is that there is a difference between the military side of the military and the civilian side. So, for instance, the Secretary of Defense, who is in the president's cabinet, is a civilian. They are not a part of the military. However, oftentimes, as of recent, these people have been ex-military members. Now, there's like a special process. You have to go through a waiver if it hasn't been a certain period of time. But for instance, our Secretary of Defense right now, Lloyd Austin, is a retired 4-star general. And his job is to interface with the civilians and also the military end. So each of these branches, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, etc., have somebody who's in charge of their branch, and that person is the joint chief of their branch. And these joint chiefs come together to make a lot of decisions based upon different aspects and needs of the military. Now, the military doesn't just have troops in the United States, it also has lots of troops elsewhere. So in the past, when we have debated military presence topics, Korea and Japan have lots of times been included because the U.S. has significant military presence in both of those countries. Another example would be not the last time, but one of the times I remember debating this topic, the U.S. had over 100,000 troops in Afghanistan, and almost all the best teams read an Afghanistan F. So there's a component to the United States military that's just not troops at home, but also assuring allies with forwardly basing these troops in 80 plus countries. So let's kind of look into how you would get into one of these branches to start with. So there's kind of two different ways. The first way would be just to enlist. You're 17, 18, you volunteer. So there's some countries like Korea, other countries, where you are required as a citizen of that country to serve in the military for a certain period of time. The United States is not one of those countries. The United States is an all-volunteer professional force. Now, the United States can compulse people to serve in the military. It's called conscription. The draft, the Selective Service Act, requires all eligible U.S. citizens to sign up for the draft if there ever was one. Now, if you enlist, you are at the bottom tier of the military. There are enlisted members of the military. They kind of perform all different sorts of duties from, the infantry on the ground to jobs that people probably don't want, to officers, which are more in charge of leadership roles. Now, there's a couple different ways to become an officer, but one of the more common ways that you see is if somebody enrolls in the U.S. Military Academy, West Point, or the Naval Academy in Annapolis, you graduate as an officer. Now, you have to serve for a certain period of time because you went to a military college, but these are things to think about, that there are differing ranks, different types of things, and this is going to also determine what your job is. So I think most pilots are all officers, things like that. There's also a whole system of warrant officers and how that works. You might be saying, well, why do we need to know all this stuff? And the reason is people are going to talk about all sorts of different aspects of this. On past topics, they've talked about all sorts of different jobs and functions that troops serve, from generals to equipment to logistics coordination to special ops to the Army Corps of Engineer to something as simple as like a military doctor or a dentist. So I think that one of the things to think about is the military is so big that we kind of run into this problem of this topic could just be anything and the military. The last thing for this component that I want to lead you with is West Asia, North Africa, in terms of the military, is kind of an interesting terminology to use because the Department of Defense divides the world into different command theaters. As you'll see on this map that I got up here, West Asia, North Africa is interesting because it has 3 different commands that this topic has. U.S. AFRICOM would be in charge of North Asia, but not Egypt. CENTCOM would be in charge of most of West Asia plus Egypt. And then Turkey would be in EUROCOM. And all of these things operate different. They're based in different places. all sorts of different things like this. And I just want to bring this up because, there might be people who talk about CENTCOM or talk about AFRICOM, and one of the things you're going to have to realize is there's a lot of countries in AFRICOM that aren't in North Africa. So there's a important distinction between all these things, and I think that is a really important starting point on this topic. So now that we've kind of looked at the commands that this is broken down into, I want to talk about the history of the US's military presence in this specific region. I'm going to go through the history of the United States military presence in the region chronologically. Hopefully this will be brief, but bear with me because there's a lot of different components, both because our military presence in this region is big and because there's just been a lot of events that are important because they dictate how we talk about the current situation in the region. So before 1980, the United States had very limited military presence in the region. Two main ones: the United States had presence at Incirlik Air Base in Turkey, which I'll talk about later when I talk about different bases and aspects to military presence. But an important aspect that this base was built with U.S. money, and also in Bahrain, where the United States had a small naval force. But outside of that, not a lot of military presence before 1980. That all changes in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution. Iran goes from being a friend of the United States to an enemy with the overthrow of the Shahs. If you are unfamiliar with the Iranian Revolution, the movie Argo, which is a Ben Affleck movie, does a really good job of explaining and going through the hostage crisis. And there's a lot of different movies that I'm going to mention throughout this because a lot of the military aspects of this region have been captured in a lot of different popular films. But the biggest thing that you need to know is that the Iranian Revolution spawned what is known as the Carter Doctrine, from President Jimmy Carter, who said the U.S. military could be used to defend national interests of the United States in the Persian Gulf, and kind of left national interests up to whatever you wanted to determine that as. So that led to the United States drastically increasing its presence in the region. So if we start, the first Gulf state that welcomed a U.S. military base was Oman, which if you go back and look at the map, that'll be really interesting at this point just to see and geographically orient yourself with all of these different countries that we have presence in. But one of the key historical events to note that a lot of different sources talk about is in 1983, there was a Marine barracks in Lebanon that was bombed. It was a barracks is like a place that houses a bunch of Marines or a bunch of military soldiers. And in Beirut, 220 Marines were killed in a bombing of one of these barracks. So you can see there's already some opposition to U.S. presence in the region. The first thing that most people equate with military presence in the region is the Gulf War. So in August of 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait, and then a couple months later, in January of 91, the U.S. led an international coalition of more than 30 countries to expel Iraq and Saddam Hussein's forces from Kuwait. So the United States contributed over 500,000 military personnel to an international force that consisted of almost 750,000 troops. This is a really important event in the region and shapes a lot of things to come. And there's a lot of movies from this war as well. There's the movie Live from Baghdad, Jarhead, Three Kings, all of which are great movies. Some other random presence that happened in the region. You might see mention of Clinton using cruise missiles against Afghanistan and Sudan in 1998, where he unsuccessfully tried to kill Osama bin Laden. Another military presence aspect that certainly shaped the United States and public opinion for certain about presence in the region was when the USS Cole, which was a U.S. warship, a destroyer, I believe, was bombed, and 17 Marines were killed as a result of this terrorist attack against the U.S. Ship that was stationed in Yemen. So these are all different aspects to how the United States presence existed before sort of what I'm going to call the Common Era. One thing to note that's kind of like North Africa is not included in here is in 1993, the U.S. participated in the Battle of Mogadishu, where the U.S. intervened in the Somalia Civil War, and 16 U.S. special operators from Delta, Rangers, different pilots died, and this was the biggest special forces loss in U.S. history until like 2011 when Extortion 17 was shot down. And if anybody is still following along with movies, there's a great movie called Black Hawk Down, which does a great job of encapsulating this time period and the U.S.'s presence in the region during this time. Now, the key thing to note with all of the presence that I've gone through so far is that it's all before 2001. And a lot of the U.S. military presence is going to change starting in 2001 with the attacks on 9/11 combined with the United States invasion of Afghanistan. So let's go there now. In 2001, the United States invaded Afghanistan. The United States had tons of U.S. military presence, and the last time that I debated this on a high school topic, this was a huge part of the topic. In 2010, 2011, the Afghanistan AF, specifically the COIN AF, was probably the biggest AF on the topic. And I could see this lecture 10 years ago being like half about Afghanistan. But since the withdrawal, which I'll get to in a second, the United States virtually has no military presence in Afghanistan now. So while I'm not talking about Afghanistan in this lecture pretty much at all, you have to realize that there's a huge history that shapes a lot of the region because of that. The next component to this is that in 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. And at the peak of this war, during the surge in 2007, the United States had over 180,000 troops that were stationed in Iraq. There's a bunch of Afghanistan movies, so I'm not going to get into that. But for the Iraq War, I think American Sniper and Hurt Locker are really, really great movies that you should check out if you have time. I know it's a lot of recommendations, but I think that they all encapsulate really well what U.S. presence looked like. I think taking a break from the Middle East and West Asia for a second, that during the same period of time that in Somalia, it definitely hit international media that piracy in Somalia was a big issue. And there was one particular piracy act that is really famous from a Tom Hanks movie called Captain Phillips that encapsulates what the world kind of looked like at that time. Now, besides Afghanistan and Iraq, the history, I wouldn't say this is of military presence, but something that you have to know in the region is that in 2011, what is known as the Arab Spring happened, where a bunch of countries in the region had change in governments because of different reasons regarding democracy, liberalization, and things like that. So while the United States presence isn't a part of this necessarily, it impacts a lot of countries that the United States has military in. So for instance, Tunisia and Egypt both had revolutions where their governments were overthrown, and there were multiple civil wars that still impact the world end of this topic to today, like Libya and Syria. Some other things to note that are important are, I haven't talked about Pakistan at all. I know that was included in the topic, but the killing of Osama bin Laden started in Afghanistan, fly to Pakistan. I think that is also an interesting component of how to view military presence, because it brings up the debate of, are special forces included? How should we view that on the topic? And I think that is a giant debate to be had on this topic. Two last things before I kind of get into the very current U.S. history, U.S. military presence, is the last time this topic was debated in college, tons of teams just read advantages talking about ISIS because it was kind of the peak of that organization's existence when the topic was debated. And that has a lot of trickle down to how the topic will be debated now, and I feel like a lot of teams will still read contentions or arguments about ISIS. Last thing, there was a Yemen civil war in 2015, kind of broke down the whole government, and that's going to influence a lot of things in the region as well. Current events, kind of the more recent things. In 2018, the United States used cruise missiles to attack Syria based on intelligence that said that Syria had used chemical weapons against civilian populations, and that was a big thing during the initial months of the Trump presidency. I want to say there were 2 times that he cruise missile struck Syria. And then more recently, 3 events that are going to definitely encapsulate the topic. The first being the United States is still in Iraq. The United States in January of 2020 used a drone to assassinate sort of the person in charge of Iran's military, and Iran reciprocated, attacked the United States base in Iraq, Al-Assad Air Base, because of this attack, and that almost led to a situation where Iran and the United States were at war. So I think that a lot of people are going to use that to talk about the topic. 2 more recent things. 2021, Biden made the decision to withdraw all U.S. troops from Afghanistan. I think lots of people will use that as an example, or authors will talk about that as a rationale behind why troops ought to be further reduced. The last thing being the most recent thing is that Israel and Gaza definitely a part of West Asia, so the current conflict between Israel and Gaza that started in October would definitely be included in this region as well. So just think about, I know I said this was going to be brief, it really wasn't, but the U.S., what that should tell you is the U.S. just has a huge presence of lots of different troops and military aspects throughout history. So hopefully this was helpful, and now I'm going to go into what the current footprint of the United States military in West Asia and North Africa encapsulates. In this final section, I'm going to talk about the current footprint, what the current military presence looks like in the West Asia, North Africa region. A couple of notes before I start. This is going to be kind of boring, so you might want to use the timestamps below to scroll through and see which part interests you. But I think that this is particularly important because it gives you kind of a scope of a lot of the important presence that the United States has in different countries in this region. I'm going to break this into 2 parts, one being West Asia and the other being North Africa. A reminder that this is just a snapshot of what our presence looks like, and that the United States' presence is both ever-changing and kind of cloaked in secrecy. Every source that I have has a different number for different troops at different bases and all sorts of things like that. So do not take anything I'm about to say or lots of the numbers in this lecture as a fact, because nothing that I am saying is comprehensive, but rather trying to give you a snapshot of what the different aspects to the topic could be. So I'm going to start with West Asia. So here's a snapshot of the map of what I think could include West Asia. Now, you could say Tajikistan should be included, all sorts of things like that. You might be right, but this is just a good starting point that I have been using for the topic. So the first country that I want to talk about our current footprint in is Turkey. I wanted to start with Turkey because Turkey is the only country in this list, I believe, that the United States is treaty bound to defend if it is attacked. The other nations are allies of the United States, but Turkey specifically has a defense commitment or a mutual defense agreement with the United States. Turkey is also a member of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which makes it a very different and interesting country to talk about compared to some of the other countries on the topic. I think that a lot of people will start with Incirlik Air Base, which you will find above me. Historically, when we have debated this topic, this has been one of the biggest areas that has been debated because the United States has 50 B-61 tactical nuclear weapons that are hosted at Incirlik Air Base. So a lot of teams in the past have just read an affirmative that got rid of these nuclear weapons. But this base is huge. It hosts a whole air wing, which consists of 3 squadrons of aircraft that do different functions, from operations to maintenance to medical missions to mission support, and is sort of a huge base forward presence that we have. There's 2,500 U.S. personnel that are stationed here, and it was a key base that was used in bombing ISIS in the different ISIS missions that the U.S. Had and still continues to have. An interesting note about Turkey is that if you think arms sales are a part of the topic, Turkey was actually kicked out of the F-35 program over accepting Russian missile defense systems. So I think that there's a lot of, interesting relations, different scenarios to be had with different parts of Turkey, just because there's different geopolitical rivals who are trying to cozy up to all of these different nations. But as you can see on the map of Turkey, Incirlik is just one base that the United States has, and that there are plenty of other bases. I'm not going to go through all of the different ones. There's another base that the U.S. used against ISIS that I'm not going to try to pronounce, but this is just an example that this is a snapshot. There's no way that this could ever potentially be comprehensive. The next country that I want to talk about is Syria. I'm going to combine Syria and Iraq together because it's facing a very common situation. So Syria has about 900 U.S. troops. Iraq has about 2,500 personnel. Both of these places face the same issue, which is that Iran does not like that the United States is here and is more or less attacking the United States bases in this region. So if you look at the map here, this was a graphic from Fox News that has all of the different U.S. bases that have been attacked in Iraq and Syria just since October of this year. So that should give you a pretty good understanding of what this looks like. And some of these bases aren't that big. So Al Tanif, which is a giant portion of our presence and what a lot of people will talk about, is pictured above me, and it's just really not that big. So I want you to sort of think about, as you're going through this, about how different presence is compared from one country to another. The other thing to note is that different air bases, specifically Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq, was one of the bases that was attacked by Iran in retribution for the assassination of Soleimani. So you'll see the picture that I have here is a picture of one of the buildings at Al-Assad Air Base that was attacked by U.S. or by Iranian cruise missiles. So all of these things are something to think about, but, definitely have U.S. presence in both of these places. The next place I want to talk about is Kuwait. Kuwait was invaded during the Gulf War. So after the Gulf War, the United States has had a giant military presence in Kuwait. A lot of scholars refer to Kuwait as the unsinkable U.S. aircraft carrier because it has so many U.S. bases in the country. If you look at this map, this is the entire country of Kuwait, and it is littered with U.S. military bases. In particular, some important ones to note, the Ali al-Salam Air Base is the way station for all troops in this region. So if you go to this region, CENTCOM is going to airlift you into this specific air base in Kuwait, most likely. Also, Camp Arifan, which you see at the bottom there, is the land headquarters for CENTCOM. Remember, the region's broken down into different commands. But the biggest takeaway from here is that the U.S. just has tons of personnel here. It has over 10 bases. It has thousands of personnel, and is just an example of this. Here's a picture of a base that the United States has, and these are just all spare tires. The United States' military is just keeping tons of tires at a random base in Kuwait. So I could see all sorts of different arguments that people could make on this topic about Kuwait. Now let's get into Saudi Arabia. Before I talk about Saudi Arabia, I want to use this to point out on the map, because we're going to talk about UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain next. So I want you to think about, in relation to the region, where those countries are, because when I show the map of those countries, it's going to be much harder to tell because they are really, really, really small. So, but let's talk about Saudi Arabia first. So Saudi Arabia, primarily now, our military presence is training missions. So, for instance, in places like Eskin Village in Riyadh, the United States does a lot of training. Before the Afghanistan and Iraq War, the United States had a huge Air Force presence at Prince Sultan Air Base, but Saudi Arabia refused access to this base for the U.S. to launch air operations against Afghanistan. So after this, the U.S. shifted to another base, which we'll talk about, Al Udeid in Qatar. But this is kind of important because it gives you some insight into what governments, what people think about the U.S. in the region, because, you know, some of the moves that the U.S. makes isn't popular or aren't popular, and that influences our different basing agreements that we have with different countries. So from Saudi Arabia, we are going to jump into the United Arab Emirates. There are two presence in the United Arab Emirates that I think are really important to know about. First is in Abu Dhabi, the Al Dhafar Air Base. It is a huge air base. The United States stores more jet fuel here than anywhere in the world, and it is also the busiest U.S. base for surveillance flights. The United States bases a lot of Global Hawks, a lot of Sentries, a lot of Global U-2 planes out of this base. And one of the things that's interesting, I know I started here, but I'm going to go back to it, is a lot of these basing agreements are cloaked in secrecy. So the United States didn't even publicly acknowledge that, and UAE didn't acknowledge that this base existed until 2017. So I think that that's going to be a core component of the topic as well. I think the second thing that's interesting about military presence in the United Arab Emirates is a port outside of Dubai named Jebel Ali, which is the U.S. Navy's most frequently visited foreign port. If anybody is familiar with the artificial palm tree islands, you can see them in the picture of the port that I have above here. And I only point that out because this port, this harbor, is actually the largest human-made deepwater port in the world. And it's just a really common destination. I think something that's interesting also is that while there's no U.S. ships permanently stationed here, U.S. ships don't have priority over commercial ships at this port. So, you know, that might be an interesting basing agreement that people will bring into question. So that is some of our presence in UAE. Now on the map, if you look at Qatar, I'm going to jump to Qatar next. So Qatar is a very small country, and in Qatar, the United States has the largest and biggest U.S. military facility in the Middle East, which is Al Udeid Air Base. Al Udeid Air Base has 10,000 personnel and runways that can service literally every single aircraft in the U.S. military arsenal. It is the command center for all allied surveillance, strike, and logistical air operations throughout the entirety of the Middle East and Afghanistan. So a lot of people are probably going to talk about Qatar and the presence that the United States has there, especially given that President Trump threatened to pull out of Qatar and said that there would be other countries in the region who would be willing to build a base. So I think that this is an interesting note. It's also interesting to note that given the current situation, that Qatar hosts a lot of Hamas leaders. So the U.S. has a huge base in this region, you can draw some conclusions for why some people might question this. If you look north of Bahrain or northwest of Qatar, Freudian slip, you'll find Bahrain. We're going to go to Bahrain next in terms of the U.S.'s current footprint in West Asia. So Bahrain is an even smaller country, but Bahrain is super important. A lot of people talked about Bahrain the last time college debated this topic, because the United States has a facility called Naval Support Activity Bahrain, and this facility is home to the United States Fifth Fleet. The Fifth Fleet is the Navy's unit that is responsible for the waters of the Persian Gulf, Red Sea, Arabian Sea, Gulf of Aden, and Gulf of Oman. So this force, this naval force that is in charge of this giant area, consists of rotating carriers, submarines, amphibious assault vehicles, mine-clearing vehicles, logistic vehicles, all sorts of different things like that. So lots of people historically have talked about Bahrain and the different facilities, especially this naval one, that the United States has there. The next country that I'd like to talk about is Jordan. Jordan I wanted to talk about not because the U.S. has a huge presence, but because the U.S. has lots of probably secret, undisclosed presence here, because the U.S. military is a sensitive domestic issue here. So the U.S. has air bases, which I've pointed out. So like this H-4 base above me was an undisclosed drone base. The Salty Air Base was a secret drone base before it was publicly known. So I just think that's interesting in terms of the sort of secret aspect to the topic, but also that different special operations troops or special forces are training in this region, and that both of those aspects of the topic are definitely part of our military presence that is going to be talked about. The last place that I'm going to talk about in West Asia is Israel. Again, just like Jordan, our military presence is really unclear in Israel because the United States and Israel don't want anybody to know what the U.S.'s presence there is. If you look at this map that I have above, the United States probably has some facilities in what is known as the Negev Desert. So it has a radar facility, which I tried to put a map of here, but it doesn't look very good, that uses radar to spot different ballistic missiles. If you think arms sales or military aid is a part of the topic, the United States has given more U.S. foreign assistance to Israel than any other country over the last 50 years. Israel gets more money from the U.S. military than anybody else. The United States also joint supports development of different military technologies with Israel. Two of these pictured here, one being the F-35 fighter program, where I believe Israel was the first country to use an F-35, and also the Iron Dome, which has been talked about on a lot of different military topics, but is missile defense technology that is used to shoot down rockets that you can see a picture of here. So I think that this will be a giant part of the topic, and don't say, oh, I didn't talk about, enough about this, or I didn't talk about the country that you wanted to talk about. It's just, there's too much presence for me to go through everything and every specific thing. So I chose different snapshots that I think are important, but I think that there are a bunch of different places and different aspects of military presence that are not included that you should explore. But I want to now switch over and go to the North Africa region part of the topic. This should be much shorter than the West Asia part that I just went through, but I want to go through and talk about the North Africa component to the topic for a second. I'll put my camera over here for a second so you can see Somalia a little better. But again, here is a map of generally what the countries included in North Africa may be, given people's different definitions of this topic. Now, obviously, the U.S. doesn't have military presence in all these different countries, so let's go through a couple of them that the United States definitely does have military presence in. So, the first one, Djibouti. This is an interesting country because there's a lot of conflicting sources as to the number of troops the United States has here. I've seen as few as 500, as many as 4,000. The camp that the United States mainly has all of its troops here is called Camp Lemonnier, and it is part of the Djibouti International Airport. Its main focus is towards security in the Horn of Africa. It is a part of a joint task force, where it leads that task force, and it is mainly focused on countering different security situations in Somalia and Yemen. It has a big UAV presence, so drones, but one of the things that I interestingly found and wanted to point out is that other countries would also like to have military presence in the region, and I think a lot of people will talk about China and Russia, and if the US pulls out, they'll go in, and I think that this is an interesting graphic that depicts that, because this Chinese military base that is being built in Djibouti is like only a few miles from this giant US military facility. And it's, we think that, the countries, the US and China, are far apart, so we can't get into a war. But in a scenario where the military bases are so close together like this, I think it brings up some interesting arguments in terms of what exactly the topic entails. We also have troops at an airfield, all sorts of different things like that in Djibouti. Somalia, we have a small, persistent force that has been used to counter Al-Shabaab, which is a terrorist group in Somalia. In 2022, Biden reauthorized the deployment of this troop force. Said it was around 500 troops, and I believe that they are mainly stationed outside of Mogadishu at an airfield called Baildagol, and this would primarily consist of special operations troops, drone strikes, intel, all sorts of things like that. I could also foresee a lot of people talking about piracy in Somalia, because the region in the Indian Ocean off the coast here has traditionally seen a lot of piracy by Somali groups that the U.S. has intervened in. Historically, I talked about this earlier, the Captain Phillips scenario and movie that happened. So I think that people will talk about different aspects to Somalia. Sort of lastly, before I get into the unknown, is Egypt. So Egypt, the U.S. has a really small U.S. military presence in. The first is that the United States has the Pentagon's largest overseas lab. So it is the largest level 3 biosafety biocontainment facility. It is called Naval Medical Research Unit 3. And this is basically just like a disease research facility that has different field sites. So if you see above me, I tried to get a picture. Let's see if a better one here. It's really just like a building in the city in Cairo. So, some of our military presence is very small. The other aspect that I found in Egypt is the United States has troops that patrol this region called Sinai. So the Sinai Peninsula, there was a war between Israel and Sinai, and the U.S. has troops that are stationed in this multinational force and observers area that sort of help peacekeep and patrol. So I could see some people talking about this aspect of the topic as well. Lastly, for anybody that's like, oh, but you didn't talk about this specific thing, I really want to talk about Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan. Sure, all those things could be a part of the topic. We have bases in Oman. We have tiny drone bases in different countries like Georgia, Cyprus, Tunisia. We have a huge Navy presence that people will talk about. A lot of people talk about secret operations. So, for instance, Stuxnet, if you're not familiar with it, is something that you should look into, because it was potentially the U.S. and Israel messing with Iran's nuclear program. So even though I said earlier Iran might not be a part of the topic, I think that it definitely could, depending on your interpretation of the topic. So again, I just wanted to end with what I started with, which is this is a snapshot of the topic rather than a comprehensive view, because it would be impossible for me to go through every part of our presence in all of these different regions. And just to prove this even further, that this lecture is just not comprehensive and could not possibly have been, here's a list that I created, and I'll link the source in the description below. But this is just a list of all the different potential bases and personnel that the U.S. has in this region. And then in just Bahrain, the United States has 12 different bases. Some are secret, some we don't know how many troops. So I think that it would just be impossible to look at this topic from a holistic perspective. But that should also just tell you what I've been saying all along, which is this topic is a big, huge topic that's really cumbersome, and a lot of people are going to have problems dealing with just because of how much depth there is to the amount of arguments that can be made on this topic. So remember, this is just a start. I didn't go into any contentions. I didn't go into anything on this topic in terms of what you should say. There's going to be a lot more of this to come. So tomorrow I'm going to do a whole video on the different words, topicality. I'm going to give you a topicality file. And then in the coming days, there's going to be 2 separate lectures for both traditional debate and progressive debate. So stay tuned for more videos, and I really hope you enjoyed this and that you will have a great time debating the January-February 2024 military presence topic in the region of West Asia and North Africa. See you soon. Bye.